Her sole object, indeed, seems to have been the reconstruction of her fortunes. She took over a cargo of goods which she bartered in Brazil for rosewood and mahogany. Returning with the woods, she sold them, bought under another stock of furniture, which she again took out to Brazil, and continued these journeys to and fro until 1837, when she settled again in Paris. She then turned once more literature and published a second novel, A Chatelaine of the 12th Century, in her modest dwelling in the Rue de la Ville L'Evêque, surrounded by her pet birds and monkeys. She led a life which many would envy up to the advanced age of 90, for her death did not take place until March 18th, 1869. Her faculties remained unimpaired to the end. She wrote, painted, played the harp, bought pictures, renewed her friendships of earlier days, and even formed new ones, among others, in intimacy with the Mademoiselle Rosa Bonheur. Her artistic sympathies may be divined from the pictures she bequeathed to the Museum of Blois. She had been attracted to Blois by her friend, by the Baron de Wimpfen. They comprised a good many copies, a good many so-called pictures of the schools of Raphael, Titian, Leonardo, and Boucher, a few canvases attributed to Proudhon, others ascribed to Reynolds, Terburg, Jean Miel, Carlo Maratti, and Girard. Two modern pictures, one by Rosa Bonheur, the other by Comte de Calix, Enfant Christ, gypsies, Venuses, Cupids, Psyches, hermits, flute players, not a hint of her Egyptian days in the palace of Elphi, of the man who had played so important a part in her life. Before her death, Madame de Ranchou, the Comtesse de Ranchou, as she liked to be called, burnt all the letters written to her by Bonaparte. It seems as if she had wished to destroy even the memory of that love which still invests her name with an interest for the student of history, a youthful, sensual, unsophisticated passion, chiefly important as giving the first indications of the desire that was to become so imperious an ambition, Bonaparte's longing for a child, a son to whom he might bequeath the heritage of his name and his glory. Chapter 6, The Reconciliation. Josephine was dining at the Luxembourg with Goyer, president of the Directory, when she received the startling news that Bonaparte had landed at Fréjus. She seems to have almost forgotten his existence and to have given up all thoughts of his return. So little place had he in her plans for the future, and so kindly had she taken to the part of a widow in search of consolation. While the husband was considering the possibilities of a divorce in Egypt, the wife was making repudiation a duty in France, forsaking Barras, who could scarcely be regarded as a lover, whose influence also was on the wane, and whose term of power was almost at an end. She made desperate overtures to Goyer, husband and wife. As soon as the husband became a member of the government after the coup d'etat of Prairiel, year 7, Goyer, a citizen of Rennes who affected a Spartan integrity and purity of manners, was Minister of Justice under the Terror, and the author of the legal formula insisted on by Fouquier Tinville. He was the casuist of the guillotine. Nothing gives such a semblance of austerity as a constant search after judicial expedients. It is a form of hypocrisy which best cloaks prevarication. Goyer was reputed austere. This reputation, together with Josephine's influence, had won him the office. She had made him the confidant of her love affairs, and Goyer, in his character protector, had urged her to divorce Bonaparte and marry Monsieur Charles. Divorce is a legal and republican institution enabling a woman who has been a man's mistress to become his concubine. Josephine hesitated, almost persuaded. Meanwhile, she came to open rupture with her brothers-in-law, Joseph and Lucien, who were Goyer's strongest opponents in the council. The Bonapartes headed the faction favorable to Napoleon. Those who expected, hoped for, and staked their future in his return, and had dreams of reconstructing France with his help. Goyer was the leader of the opposition, comprising Napoleon's bitterest enemies, Bernadotte, Championnet, Jourdan, Moulin. All the political generals the Jacobins had invented Goyer, the virtuous republic. token civilian, only to checkmate the conqueror. But the more Goyer showed himself hostile to Bonaparte, the more acceptable he seemed to Josephine to secure the continued protection and help of the Goyers. She even proposed a marriage between their son and her daughter Hortense, the girl whose happiness she invariably subordinated to her own interests and convenience, and whom she was now prepared to sacrifice without the least remorse, as indeed she effectually did later on. The negotiations were at their height, and the families were dining quietly together when the news burst upon them. Bonaparte had landed and was on his way to Paris. Swift as the post had been, he was doubtless following close on their heels. He would not have broken quarantine in order to make triumphal entries into the towns on his route. There was no time to deliberate or ask counsel. Only one course was open: to face the situation boldly and carry matters with a high hand. This Josephine at once proceeded to do with Goyer, whose adhesion she was determined to secure at any price. President, she said, have no fears as to Bonaparte's intentions. They are not hostile to liberty, but we must combine to prevent him from falling under the influence of traitors. Goyer will serve his turn, no doubt, upon occasion, but at the moment Bonaparte is the all-important person. Josephine orders post horses without a moment's delay. She proposes to meet the traveler halfway, thus avoiding all explanations, to fall into his arms, to revive his dying passion, and her lover recaptured, to enter Paris in his carriage, to return to the Rue Chateaubriand on his arm, and thus to receive the mortified Bonapartes, who would never dare to speak under such conditions, or, if they did, would speak to deaf ears. This time there was none of the hesitation and delay that had marked the departure for Italy. Dispensing alike with Louise Compoint for Tournay and baggage, Josephine flew forward on the road to Burgundy. Bonaparte, however, had taken the Bourbonnais route, and while Josephine was urging on her postilions and straining her eyes to catch sight of the expected carriage, her husband was already in the Rue de la Victoire. She hastened back, but she had been obliged to travel as far as Lyon, where the two roads which divide at Fontainebleau reunite. 3 days had passed, during which Bonaparte, his determination to break with Josephine, confirmed by the stories he had heard in Egypt, had questioned his brothers, his sisters, and his mother. No possible doubt remained as to her conduct in Milan and the even more scandalous proceedings of the last 17 months. Anxious to spare either her or their brother, the Bonapartes seemed to have withheld a good deal. Possibly they did not know all. However, what they told was sufficient. Napoleon announced his decision. It seemed irrevocable and was entirely approved by his family. It was in vain that friends to whom he confided his wrongs begged him to put aside his private griefs in the presence of a people's acclamations, reminding him that the country who looked to him for salvation should be spared a scandal which touched his honor, that the reconstruction of the state was his first duty, and that his divorce was no such pressing matter, that to proclaim himself an outraged husband was to court ridicule, and that ridicule is fatal in France. But Bonaparte was immovable. Shall go. She shall go, he protested. What do I care what people say? They will gossip about it for 2 days, and on the third it will be forgotten. No consideration availed to touch or soften him. His own interests weighed as nothing in the balance against his just indignation, to avoid an interview which might shake his resolution, for he knew full well how great was Josephine's power over his senses. He still feared her power of his heart. He caused her clothes, jewels, and all her personal property to be removed from his house and lodged with the concierge, making an appointment with his brothers for the next morning. When he proposed to go into the necessary formalities, he shut himself in his own room on the first floor and waited. At last Josephine arrived in a state of mind bordering on frenzy. Her all was at stake, and the game was more than half lost. For the first time in her life, perhaps, she had reflected seriously during her journey, and all the terrors of her position forced themselves upon her. If she failed to see him, to make her peace with him, what would become of her? Where would she find shelter? Flirtations such as that with Monsieur Charles were all very well for a month, a year, but how could she have been so foolish, not as to have had a lover, but as to have allowed herself to be found out? Then there was Barras and others, and the open warfare with the Bonapartes and her debts, above all her debts. Her brain reeled at the thought, incapable of the simplest calculations, always buying, never paying, or perhaps imagining, as frequently happened, that she had discharged the whole debt when she had merely paid some trifling sum on the account. She was already harassed, or she continued to be throughout the empire to the end of her days by a long train of creditors who were always tempting her with some fresh extravagance, in whose accounts she was perpetually swelling, heedless of the inevitable day of reckoning. When this at last overtook her, she would lose all self-control, weep, sob, make the most extraordinary proposals, invoke the help of heaven or the devil, and if she managed to gain a little time, would imagine her difficulties at an end. Such a crisis was upon her at this very time. She is said to have been 1,200,000 francs in debt to her tradespeople alone. It is very possible her bankruptcies were generally on this Homeric scale. There were besides other secret transactions. She had bought national property to the value of 1,195,000 francs in the canton of Glavé, department of Dial, and still owed 2/3 the sum. The other third was to have been furnished by her aunt, Madame Renaudin, afterwards Madame de Beauharnais, who could not produce a sixpence. Josephine had also bought from Citizen Le Couteau on Floreal, the second year, 7, the estate and domain of Malmaison, 225,000 francs for the main purchase, 37,516 francs for mirrors, furniture, and domestic utensils, and 9,111 francs in stamp duties, fees. She finally paid the 37,516 francs for the furniture with her diamonds and jewels, but the rest was still owing. And who would pay? She could say with truth that Bonaparte had visited Malmaison before his departure and had offered 250,000 francs for the property, very nearly the price she had paid for it. But after this, Bonaparte had seigneury, to which he had taken a still greater fancy, abandoning it, however, in favor of an estate in Burgundy, besides which Josephine had no powers to represent her husband in any business transaction. He had left his money in the hands of his brother Joseph. Josephine's annual allowance of 40,000 francs was paid by Joseph, and to Joseph alone he had confided his plans. At this time his letters to his wife had entirely ceased. Joseph indeed paid in advance of 15,000 francs to the Le Couteau, but the receipt dated Messidor 17 years 7 was made out to the general, and Josephine was still responsible for the 15,000 francs, as she had elected to be married on the system of separate estate. Nothing was her own, not even the house in the Rue de la Victoire. It had been bought and paid for by Bonaparte. Her last resource was her jewel casket, filled to overflowing during the Italian sojourn. She is said to have delighted in exhibiting its contents, which, as a feminine contemporary declared, were worthy to figure in the Arabian Nights. She had also the pictures, statues, and antiquities gleaned during the Italian campaign. But what were all these as compared with the sums she had to pay? What indeed is compared with those she had forgotten? The case was truly a desperate one, for she was now too old for further conquests. Years had left their traces on a skin that had been ruined by pain. Her figure was graceful and supple as ever, but her face was losing its charm. A Creole married at 16, fully matured at 12. Tertier relates how in 1776 or 1778 he paid his court to her. She was much older than a woman of the same age in our latitudes. At 37 she was almost an old woman. It is her last chance, therefore, and realizing to the utmost the desperate nature of her fortunes, she clung passionately to the hope that Napoleon would see her and that she should be able to soften him. She succeeded in forcing an entrance into the house, and now Bonaparte's personal stronghold had to be stormed. After knocking repeatedly at the door in vain, she knelt down, sobbing aloud. Still the door remained shut. The scene was prolonged for hours, for a whole day, without any sign from within. Worn out at last, Josephine was about to retire in despair, but her maid, aghast, led her back to the door and hastily fetched her children. Eugène and Hortense, kneeling beside their mother, mingled their supplications with hers. Hereupon the door opened. Speechless, the tears streaming from his eyes, his face convulsed with the terrible struggling that had rent his heart. Bonaparte appeared, holding out his arms to his wife.